Ready to dive into a side of organized crime that's both surprisingly expansive and surprisingly under the radar.
We're talking about the Albanian Mafia.
Okay.
Now, I know what you might be thinking. Wikipedia, seriously.
Er.
But trust me, this deep dive into their world is going to be anything but boring.
Yeah, you see, the Albanian Mafia, it gives us a fascinating look into how organized crime can evolve.
Mhm.
They've exploded onto the global scene. They've created a network that stretches across continents, all while sticking to a structure you just don't see in a lot of these traditional mafia groups.
Yeah, it's true. It's like they appeared out of thin air in the early 1990s, just as post-communist Albania was struggling to find its footing. The whole country was incredibly volatile, very little rule of law. It was even labeled Europe's only narco state.
And that term, narco state, it's important, right? It wasn't just hyperbole. Albania essentially became a major hub for drug trafficking, with corruption reaching the highest levels of government. Imagine a scenario where law enforcement is compromised, borders are porous, and the economy is desperate. That's like fertile ground for an organization like the Albanian Mafia to take root.
So it sounds like they weren't just opportunistic. They were able to truly capitalize on that chaos and turn it into a power base.
Absolutely. And they were smart about it too. They didn't try to reinvent the wheel. They formed key partnerships, right, with established players like the Turkish and Italian mafias. These alliances gave them access to already existing smuggling routes, established criminal networks, and the kind of practical knowledge you need to thrive in the underworld.
Yeah, it's almost like they were getting a crash course in organized crime from the veterans.
Exactly. And if you look at the early days, their ambition becomes really apparent. We see these tendrils reaching out across the globe, connections to China for trafficking, infiltration of banks in Israel.
Wait, hold up. Infiltrating banks in Israel. That's some next level stuff. What were they after?
Money laundering, primarily. It was a bold move. It showcased their audacity. They weren't content with it just being small-time players. They wanted a piece of the global financial pie.
Hmm.
And then there's the South American connection, which is a story for the ages, but we'll circle back to that later.
Okay, you definitely have my attention now. Let's talk about how this sprawling criminal enterprise actually functions. From what I've read, it all revolves around family, right?
Yes. The Albanian Mafia, they place family at the very core of their structure. They operate within these tightly knit clans known as fists, and this is what makes them so different and so successful. Think of it like this.
Okay, so you've got these fists, these family clans. It's like the Corleones, but instead of one family, it's like a whole network of them, right?
That's a great way to think about it. Each fist operates with a level of autonomy, but ultimately answers to a larger collective. And they're incredibly hierarchical, almost like a well-oiled business, you could say.
So who's calling the shots at the top of this family business? I mean, who's the Albanian Tony Soprano we're talking about here?
Well, it's not quite as straightforward as having one single boss, like in some mafia groups. The top tier of each fist is the Bajarak, which you can think of as an executive board.
Okay.
They make the major decisions. Then you've got the Cry, which translates directly to boss overseeing operations, with the Cryatar or underboss handling the day-to-day activities. What's interesting is the role of the Mick.
Mick. That sounds kind of friendly.
The word means friend, but their role is anything but casual. Mix are like the ultimate networkers. They're the liaisons between different fists, smoothing over deals, resolving disputes. They're crucial for maintaining that sense of unity across a sprawling criminal organization.
Okay, that's some seriously intricate organizational design. But all this talk of family and networking makes me think of trust. I mean, how do they keep everyone in line? Is it just blood ties?
Blood ties are definitely a factor, but there's something even more powerful at play here. BESA, the Albanian Code of Honor.
You mentioned BESA earlier. What's fascinating is it seems to go beyond just a code of conduct. It's like the bedrock of Albanian society in general.
Absolutely. BESA translates to faith or promise, and it's deeply ingrained in Albanian culture. In the context of the mafia, it ensures loyalty, obedience, and most importantly, silence. Betrayal is the ultimate taboo, punishable by death.
So we're talking like omerta, but on another level.
You could say that it's omerta amplified by centuries of tradition, cultural reinforcement. Imagine trying to flip a witness when they believe that breaking their besa would bring shame upon their family, not just in this life, but for generations to come.
That's terrifying and incredibly effective. No wonder law enforcement has such a hard time cracking this nut. It's like trying to break into Fort Knox if Fort Knox was built on like a foundation of unwavering loyalty.
Precisely. And this rigid structure, bound by besa, allows them to maintain their operations with remarkable efficiency resilience.
Okay, so we've got the family structure, the code of silence, but what about their global footprint? You mentioned South America, China, Israel. It's a pretty diverse portfolio for a group with such strong ties to their Albanian heritage. Okay, so we've got the family structure, the code of silence, but what about their global footprint? You mentioned South America, China, Israel. It's a pretty diverse portfolio for a group with such strong ties to their Albanian heritage.
It is, and that's what makes their story so fascinating. They understand the power of strategic expansion. Let's start with Italy, for instance. They could have tried to directly challenge the Italian mafia,
Right.
but that would have been a bloodbath.
Yeah, a recipe for disaster, for sure. So how did they manage to break into a scene that's already dominated by these established players?
They saw an opportunity in the changing landscape of organized crime. In the 90s, the Italian mafia was facing a lot of heat from law enforcement. So the Albanian mafia stepped in, offering their services, taking on the riskier aspects of the drug trade. It was a win-win situation. The Italians got to reduce their exposure, and the Albanians got a foothold in one of the world's biggest drug markets.
Smart move. Fly under the radar, build up your resources, and then make your move. Speaking of which, the outline mentioned their presence in the UK and Australia. What's the story there?
Their expansion into the UK and Australia really showcases their adaptability. In the UK, they started with prostitution, cigarette smuggling, gradually working their way up to dominate the cocaine trade by the 2010s. The article describes them as being present at almost every level of society, which is both impressive and unnerving.
Almost every level of society that sends chills down my spine. It reminds me of that saying, the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist.
Exactly. They operate quietly, blending into the background, using legitimate businesses as fronts for their operations. There's a quote from the article about them using restaurants and cafes for money laundering. Just goes to show how good they are at hiding in plain sight.
Yeah. It's a stark reminder that organized crime isn't just about violence and intimidation. It's about strategy, intelligence, knowing how to exploit the weaknesses of a system. And when it comes to ambition, it seems the Albanian Mafia had that in spades. They even went toe-to-toe with one of the biggest names in the American Mafia, the Gambino family.
Oh, yeah. The story of the Rudaj organization.
Yeah.
It's a perfect example of their audacity. You have this relatively small group, mostly Albanian immigrants, who decide to challenge a criminal empire in their own backyard, New York City. They weren't afraid to flex their muscles, even taking over a Gambino-controlled club at one point.
Talk about a power move. So what went wrong? Why didn't they become the sixth family, as some people were calling them?
Hubris, perhaps? They made some tactical errors, and their brazen approach ultimately backfired. The feds were already onto them, and this very public challenge gave law enforcement the ammunition they needed to dismantle the Rudaj organization.
Yeah. It's a classic rise and fall story, but one that holds some important lessons about the changing dynamics of organized crime. So what's the takeaway here? Should we be worried about the Albanian Mafia? Are they going to become the next big threat in the criminal underworld?
It's not about predicting the future. It's about understanding the patterns, right? The Albanian Mafia story highlights the fact that organized crime thrives in the shadows. The more we learn about their methods, their reach, their unique structure, the better equipped we are to address the challenges they pose.
Knowledge is power, as they say, and this deep dive has definitely given me a whole new perspective on the complex, often invisible world of organized crime. It's a reminder that the battle against these networks is often fought not on the streets, but in the intricacies of finance, law enforcement, even our own cultural blind spots.
Exactly. And perhaps the most crucial question we should be asking ourselves is not how to stop them, but rather what creates the conditions for a group like the Albanian Mafia to emerge and flourish in the first place.
Lots to think about.
Yeah.
Until next time.